All right, so in this video, I'm going to walk you through the process of creating a ball toss animation inside of Blender. So really this animation is just a character throwing a ball in the air and catching it. I wanted to keep it really simple so we can just focus on just some simple body mechanics, which a weight shift like this is really great to do. And we're just adding a little bit more complexity by actually having the character throw a ball in the air, and you're working with constraints and making sure you're able to have that proper constraint switch with the right hand and the left hand, and then having the ball, detached from those hands so you can freely animate it. One thing to keep in mind is that I did this video a little bit differently. I have a few videos on my YouTube where I've done this, where I basically recorded the entire process and then I went back to do kind of a walkthrough over the video. So it's not necessarily like complete step by step where I call everything I do, but hopefully you're still able to follow along pretty easily with kind of the steps I'm taking. So the goal of this was just to keep the animation really, really simple and just try to complete it within about an hour and a half. So like I said, just focusing on, very simple body mechanics. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into the walkthrough.
The approach I took for this is a layered approach, which is typically how I animate. There are different levels to that. Sometimes I might start focusing on kind of like the main pose first. Maybe for something like a run cycle or a walk cycle, it's always good to kind of establish your sort of main kind of contact pose and build off from there. But for this method, this is a very heavily layered approach where I start with figuring out the movement of the main mover cog control for the entire body. I make sure I get that established in there, and then I slowly add more and more detail. I start adding some rotation to that cog movement. I start adding some translation up and down. Then I might start getting, just the hip involved, and then start adding in a bit of upper chest to it. So it's very basically working from the center cog control out on this character. And this allows me to focus on movement first, focusing on the feeling of the shot, focusing on the timing, the spacing, making sure I'm getting that weight shift to feel correct, rather than getting caught up in the minute pose details before I even really start creating any type of movement. For me, I want to make sure I get movement in there first before really thinking about much else. So I'll go ahead and play this video here. You can see it's almost about an hour and a half here that we'll walk through. And I actually started this recording a little bit after I started, so I actually added a little bit of rotation to the side-to-side movement, but really what I have here, the only thing I have established is the left and right movement of the main cog control, and kind of figuring out the timing and the spacing of that. Again, looking at my reference off on the side is typically how I work, so I have my reference on another monitor and kind of just checking that. And I went ahead and just added that rotation on the Z-axis to kind of show where I'm at. So basically I have side-to-side movement and a bit of rotation Z kind of twist on the main cog control. And now I'm going to add in some up and down movement, some translate Z, to figure out along this weight shift how much are the hips moving up and down, and how I can start to establish that in this shot. And typically when looking at reference, in the reference I shot, there's a very minimal amount of up and down movement, but it's something I needed to exaggerate to feel it more in the animation. Now, in the reference, there obviously is up and down movement. So it's kind of like taking that up and down movement that's in the reference and kind of just pushing it a bit, just so that it's actually something that's visible in animation. Oftentimes, if you're just translating, your reference one-to-one into animation, it's going to feel a little floaty. It's not going to feel really as good as if you started to kind of push some of that movement in there in the actual animation itself. So again, here, just focusing on the up and down movement, a little bit of trial and error of trying things, figuring out, okay, the hip is going to dip down and then it's going to go up on the throw. So dip down, up, and then kind of have this down settle at the end. You can see it's all pretty subtle movement in there, but it does start to add a bit more feeling of weight to this movement. And doing this kind of layered approach does help me figure out really the overall movement of this animation. And once you really have the main movement established in there, I find it's a little bit easier to start adding in those fine details. And you can see there, I just tried bringing the hips down lower to see if I liked it. This is kind of my process of animation as well. again, going back to that trial and error of just trying things, playing around with your animation. This I probably stuck close to the reference, and then I was like, you know, what happens if I dip the hip down really low there? Didn't like it and just moved on. It's good to just try things out quickly to see if you like it. And then if not, you can always remove it. And here it looks like I'm going back and tweaking the rotate Z on the cog control a little bit. I think I want to add like a little bit of overshoot right here on the rotate Z as it's coming back toward the settle. Now, one difficult thing with, you know, a layered approach like this is that you do need to kind of trust the process. When you are working very pose to pose, stepped keyed, your animation looks really good at the beginning, and it's really exciting when you're animating it like that. Your animation is starting to take shape. You have some really nice poses in there. However, for myself, I found my animation would really break apart once I moved beyond step mode, and I would have, you know, a ton of frustration realizing my timing and spacing was off, realizing the movement and the transitions between poses weren't feeling natural. This way, I'm able to really establish, again, that movement first. We're creating animation. We're not creating, you know, comic book poses, still frames. We are creating movement. Now, obviously, it's super important to have really strong poses, but poses are something you can always go back and tweak. We have animation layers. We can completely change a pose and still keep the underlying animation there. So I think that's another big part of why I like a layered approach like this. And here it looks like I'm just refining the translate X on the torso. You can see I basically have this sort of like movement back towards screen right, and then this movement, the quick movement as she throws the ball, and then that sort of overshoot settle there. Pretty simple curve, but I'm starting to establish the movement. And it looks like here I'm going to start tweaking the chest control. So basically moving up from the cog, starting to refine that chest movement of this character. And here it looks like I'm actually going back to tweak the translate Y, the back and forth. I think I started to move on to the chest a little bit. Looks like I'm just tweaking the pose of the chest here, but I'm really trying to figure out the weight. The character feels a little bit off balance from the side view, so again, I'm just going here and starting to tweak the pose a little bit to find something that feels a bit more natural, a bit more in balance. And again, you can see in this process that I am, you know, just trying things, playing around with things, seeing if I can tweak the pose to make it better. You can always commit to that tweak or just go back to the way it was. And this is also my workflow that might vary a bit. I mean, everybody works differently, but you know, oftentimes it's said to really know exactly what you're going to animate before you ever jump into your 3D software, whether it's Blender or Maya. Like having a strong foundation of like, once I open up the software, I know exactly what poses I'm going to create. I know what I want it to look like. For me, that doesn't really work because I love seeing my animation in 3D space in the environment it's going to be in, and actually playing around with it in that 3D space rather than, you know, whether I'm doing like 2D thumbnail sketches. I find it's better to do that experimenting in the 3D software and really starting to refine that. And here I'm just going back and refining that rotation Z on the torso again, making tweaks, realizing I need to change some things, and kind of just going back to it as needed. And here I'm just playing around with the back and forth of the hips on the translate Y. And this is something, again, I'm kind of just playing around with. My reference I had was only from the straight on front view that you saw. So it was a little bit difficult to kind of figure out what the body was doing from the side view, but just playing around with it in Blender and tweaking some curves and trying to figure out maybe the translate why the hips go, back a bit and then go forward, and kind of just playing around with that movement. And obviously something that I missed in this recording, because I accidentally started it like 10 minutes into the process, was for the ball here, I just have a child of constraint on that ball constrained to the right hand. And then eventually we'll switch that constraint when she actually throws the ball in the air and catches it with her other hand. And you can see, like, as I'm animating here, I'll play the animation and just play it through several times to get a sense of the movement and kind of figure out what sort of the next thing I need to layer on here to continue to flesh it out. And when I'm moving my mouse off the screen like that, it's probably because I'm kind of just scrubbing through the reference a bit. And obviously it's extremely important to have reference, especially when working on any type of, body mechanics shot like this. You can't really just wing it and kind of just make stuff up as you go. You can, and it can turn out cool, but the process will probably end up being longer than if you had at least some decent reference to sort of base your animation off of at the beginning. Here looks like I'm tweaking the rotate Y of just the hip control, figuring out the weight shift, how the hips are shifting over, and then how they're going to kind of rotate once that weight transitions over the left leg. So you can see kind of just tweaking this curve here in these keyframes, because it should probably swing over. That's obviously kind of super floaty feeling. So I'm kind of tightening up the timing there. And obviously you can see with this layered approach, something that can be a little bit scary or daunting is that we are not worrying about really where our keyframes are between, the controls. Obviously the keyframes on my hips are all completely different than the cog control. I'm kind of just going in here and just working kind of freely, and not necessarily working about like making sure at the beginning of an animation, which you typically would do if you were working, more pose to pose, is that your keyframes would all be, landing on the same frame. Your main poses would all land, on the same frames, and you wouldn't really start offsetting things until you were further on in sort of the refining stages. But here, obviously, with the layered approach, I'm just, tweaking my keyframes, changing my timing per control based off what feels right. Looks like I just brought the hip overall up a bit there. And here I believe I'm going to start tweaking the translate Y, the sort of side-to-side rotation of the entire cog control on this. So you can see as she goes, her hips move screen right, she kind of dips just a little bit, kind of bringing that arm lower again, thinking about, this is where she's sort of about to kind of getting ready, almost the anticipation to throwing the ball. So her arm is going to kind of drop there a bit. And it's something, you can see in the reference where my arm kind of drops a bit, my body sort of rotates in that direction. And again, with the layered approach, this is something where you kind of have to trust the process, where it might not look great at the very beginning, but you kind of have to trust that you're going to get there eventually once you start, adding, layering on more and more detail. But at the very beginning, it can look a little bit rough, and that even goes further if you are doing another workflow that I use very often is the cube method, where I animate a cube first and literally just constrain the character to that cube and kind of just animate and get the cube feeling correct first. That can be another thing where you kind of have to trust the process, because you throw your character on a moving cube, the character's obviously going to look like like a kind of just an action figure bobbing around. So you do have to really trust, kind of like you'll get to that place eventually. And you can see, like, with this, only the torso and the hips are really moving at this point. But I'm really trying to establish sort of the rotation and the weight shift that's happening with the main cog control. And then here, I'm probably going to actually start counter animating a bit of the cog control movement with the chest, because you can see with just the cog rotated, the entire body is rotating over, and it's too far over towards screen left. But when I actually start counter animating the chest and offsetting that, we're going to get some nice solid body mechanics in there, with the chest kind of countering what the hips are doing a bit. So that will kind of offset that far rotation over in that direction. You can see as I start to bring the chest over, kind of countering the rotation of the hips. And again, similar to a lot of the other, controls, animating just, one rotation axis at a time, kind of figuring out that movement on the throw, kind of figuring out the movement on that weight shift, and kind of how that settle is going to happen, how that overshoot should feel in there. And here I'm just tweaking the rotation along the z-axis, the sort of twist. So figuring out how that twist is going to kind of motivate the throw of the arm and the hand. And again, this is where you kind of got to just imagine what's happening here. Looking at your reference, knowing that this is the part where the hand or the arm is actually going to be in the air, and kind of just visualizing that. You don't need to pose it out. You just need to make sure you're thinking about all that stuff. At this point, the hand is going to be extended. This is the point where maybe she's actually completely let go of the ball from her right hand. So like thinking about how is the chest kind of motivating that throw. And what I do like about a layered approach like that is I do find it easier to sort of figure out and get the offset that is happening in the body very early on, and a little bit easier, I feel like, because working layered like this, you're not necessarily worrying about keeping things on the same keyframes. You can see we're getting already a nice fleshy feeling to this weight shift just by animating basically just the torso control, starting to animate the chest and a little bit of hip movement. And we've already established the base for this weight shift here. Here I'm kind of pushing a bit the translate Z and seeing how much I can push this movement in the actual throw of the ball. You can see I dialed that back a bit, trying a different thing. I think I know I want to bring the hips down a little bit more. I think that might have just been a little bit too much. And to kind of finish my thought earlier about, a layered approach allowing you to really establish that offset between body parts early on, because, as you're moving, your body is constantly kind of like counter animating, and really, for example, like in this weight shift, my chest is really countering the rotation of the hips right in here. And that this layered approach kind of allows you to sort of establish the movement that happens in that process, in that weight shift, and not necessarily just focusing on the poses themselves to actually sell that sort of nice sort of counter animation that's happening between the hips and the chest. By establishing that counter movement in the actual animation itself first, and getting that feeling correct, and then you can always go back and tweak and refine the poses further as needed. But yeah, as we're moving, our body is constantly kind of countering. Nothing is really moving at the exact same time. The chest movement is going to sort of drive the movement of that shoulder, and then that shoulder movement is going to drive the movement of the arm coming up to throw. So all of those things are kind of working. They're working together to drive that movement, but they're not all happening at the same time. And again, a layered approach like this does help you establish that pretty early on. And there's a bit of a long pause here. Could be looking at the reference, could be switching songs. Usually I like to work with music. If I'm just animating, I almost always have to have music or something on. I find it easier for me to kind of focus, kind of get into the zone a bit better. Here I'm just pushing that rotate Y on the chest control just a little bit more. Above here, I'm going to start actually animating the right arm. And I think here I'm just establishing a selection set for the right arm just to allow me to, have something that allows me to select all those controls a little bit faster with just, selecting that set there. Makes it just a little bit easier. I think the first thing I'm working on here is the shoulder movement for this. Kind of working the shoulder and the main kind of upper arm control first through this throw. Probably just flipping through that reference there. I will say something that has always bothered me about Blender is like the finicky feeling of the rotate gizmo there. It can be a little bit hard to like get exactly what you want. So oftentimes I will just straight up move to the sort of, this, the transform channels and the channel box on the right to actually dial in those rotation values. And on this throw of the ball here, I think, starting this, I am actually working with all, the poses of this throw all on the same frames, which is one of the reasons why I have this selection set, so I can select everything and drop a keyframe down. Eventually I'll start, offsetting things in here. But I think right here, I'm kind of just establishing the poses of this throw and what frame they're going to land on. You can see here I'm actually tweaking this rotation straight in the channel box by just selecting and dragging in the viewport to dial in that rotation. And I think, this getting this arm throw feeling good, getting the catch to feel good is going to be, was a tricky part of this animation. And, oftentimes when, doing an animation like this where the body mechanics of it are, simple, there's not even a step going on. There's just sort of a weight shift from one foot to the other. So again, kept it really simple. It's not, crazy parkour movement. She's not stepping around in the scene. She's literally standing in place and doing this throw. But oftentimes, these very simple shots can be some of the most difficult to do because they are so subdued, and it does require to really pick out those minute details that can often be, overlooked in the reference, but making sure you're finding those tiny little movements of the body and adding them to your animation, pushing them in your animation as well. And yeah, just kind of basing this off the reference here of, where the arm is at these frames. I've already established the movement of the main body. So that is also helping me drive this throw and figuring out where the arm would be, as the body is helping kind of drive that motion there. And obviously this is feeling really rough where it feels like the upper arm moves, stops, and then the elbow moves. So it feels, you know, way too offset from each other. It feels very robotic. Obviously this is going to be more of one kind of fluid motion with the hand. So here I'm trying to remedy that a bit and trying to get something that feels a bit more natural on that throw. And I think that already starts looking quite a bit better. Just making sure the movement on the upper arm is not stopping. Where, before it was like the upper arm moved, then the elbow moved. So just making sure it, has a smooth transition there. And I think here is the transition where I think the ball should be already out of this hand. So I think now it's kind of dropping that arm a bit. So I'm kind of just establishing that here. I think already that was looking too harsh on the drop. So kind of just dialing that back a bit. It looks like I'm actually just retiming this a bit. Felt a little offset from the chest, like it was happening too early. So just tweaking around the timing just a little bit. Again, just playing around with things, seeing everything in motion, and kind of refining and tweaking from there. Here I'm just starting to bring the arm down, back to her side. And again, thinking about, the hand, when that hand is throwing it, it's going to throw, but that hand motion is going to continue forward. So it looks like I'm kind of just establishing that in there. And again, this later approach, a lot of the times it is like just imagining what is happening at that point. The ball is still stuck in her hand. I haven't worried about, switching the constraint to the other hand. The other hand isn't even animated yet, but I just want to make sure I'm thinking about the overall movement in there, looking at my reference and making sure I have that all established in there. And you can see that's already working pretty well, just with those few poses in there that, as that arm drops back to her side, you can feel that arm dropping is kind of what's helping drive that overshoot weight shift a little bit as, her arm drops and then her chest is kind of like countering and reacting to that drop of the arm. And again, this workflow helps me establish good movement first. I could have spent this entire time of animating the right arm just focusing on like getting the perfect pose for the throw and the perfect pose for the anticipation of the throw. But again, poses can always be tweaked. For me as an animator, I just want to figure out like how is this moving and what feels good, like what feels natural, what feels appealing in the movement. Those are the things I want to figure out really as early as I can. And here I'm just trying to refine the overshoot of this. And again, this is something where I think completely up until this point, the shoulder, the upper arm, the elbow, and the hand are all timed. The keyframes are all landing at the exact same spot. So there's no like offset going on at this point. I'm kind of figuring out the main movement here. And chances are, with the arm throw here, everything is, on the same keyframe. There's no like offset between the elbow and the upper arm yet. But if, without that and you already have, movement that feels good, just adding those little offsets in there will kind of just be that sort of like cherry on top of, taking it to the next level. And, that long pause there, probably just looking at the animation over and over, making sure I, see if I spot anything that feels weird or unnatural. And kind of just taking a step back for a moment before continuing on. I think here I'm starting to animate the shoulder a bit. I think on this satellite, pretty much only animated the upper arm, so making sure, that shoulder is going to be helping to drive a lot of that movement. So that's definitely something that can be easy to forget about is the shoulder. It's always good to go back and make sure you've got, some movement in there because, chances are if your arm is moving, then your shoulder is going to kind of have to have movement in there. And I think now that I've established the movement of the right arm, it kind of allows me to spot like kind of what's missing in the chest. So now I'm going to go back and add the rotation X just on the chest, the sort of back and forth, which will really help push the throw as well. The chest kind of dipping down and then, rotating back on the actual throw. And again, this is something that just pushing beyond the reference, because I remember in the reference, my body movement was all very subtle. Intentionally, I was trying to keep things simple and subtle. So this is obviously going to be pushed quite a bit from that. But you still can spot those tiny rotations that are happening in your reference. I know even though they might be very, very small, you can kind of see that little bit of dip in the chest as the arm drops. For the sort of bit of a kind of the antic of the actual throw, the kind of hand dropping first and then coming up, that chest is going to kind of drop, and then on the throw, that rotate X on the chest is kind of going to start like rotating back. So again, kind of just pushing that a bit in the actual animation. And here I'm starting to actually start offsetting the movement a bit on the shoulder, pushing the shoulder poses a bit as well. And I think I wanted to establish a bit more of a snap feeling on that shoulder just a bit more right there. Kind of bringing it up a little bit faster. And here I'm offsetting the elbow a bit, getting a bit more looseness in the arm on that drop. But you can really start to see, one control at a time. We're getting detail into this. This is already starting to, look like, she's throwing the ball, even though the other arm isn't animated at all. You can feel from the movement of the arm kind of what's happening there, that sort of snap in the air, and that quick kind of drop back to her side. And I think this was a pause in the recording. I probably stepped away, came back either the next day to finish this off or a few hours. But I think at this point, now I'm going to start animating the left arm. I think I already created this selection set for it. So again, similar process with the right arm. Now going through here and figuring out what this left arm is going to do through all of this. Probably, checking my reference there. And it probably would have been easier for everyone watching to, have my reference in the viewport as I'm working, just so you can kind of see what I'm, kind of scrubbing through in the reference. And usually I try to remember to do that, when I'm doing like a live demo, I'll try to have, actual reference in the viewport. Now that does oftentimes slow the viewport down, which is another reason why I don't like having reference in the viewport, because usually when I have reference in the viewport, I'm looking at my reference and then I'm, hiding it so that I can actually get, real-time playback in the viewport, which is another reason why I always just have reference up on the other monitor and just kind of scrubbing through on the other monitor to check. Here, I think I'm just bringing that shoulder back as the arm kind of moves back and rotates up a bit to kind of tuck beside her in order to actually catch the ball. Because the ball, she's not throwing the ball out in front of her, she's kind of just throwing it straight up. So she's not necessarily having to reach really far forward with the arm, which means she's kind of has to tuck her arm back to her side in order to catch it. So I'm kind of just bringing that shoulder back a bit. And again, with that reference, the goal was just really to just shoot reference of, just casually throwing the ball from one hand to the other with, getting like a small weight shift in there. And I think here's the point where I think she either catches the ball right there or is kind of preparing to. And again, because we're not animating the ball yet, this is all kind of just acting it out, almost miming it out, like what the action actually would be if the ball were to land in her hand at that moment. What would the arm do? So it's kind of just visualizing the ball kind of traveling up in the air and then landing in her hand. And something with these shoulders on this rig that's a bit tricky is that it's hard to get great shoulder positions because I do feel like on this particular rig, the shoulders feel like pretty far out where you have this really kind of large gap in there that it feels like the shoulders should be like translated in closer to the body. They feel like kind of really far out. So sometimes I do actually bring the shoulders in a bit. I'm just kind of trying to establish the feeling that's going to have on the arm when the ball, lands in her hand. Obviously, the ball is not super heavy, but you still want to feel that kind of reaction a bit on the arm. And here, I think I'm just trying to work on refining the settle of this arm a bit, figuring out kind of the overshoot. I think here, I'm not sure exactly what my plan is. I think I might be moving on to the fingers a little bit. Although this is a bit of a pause. Oh, there we go. Looks like I'm starting again. I think here I'm probably going to establish a selection set for left fingers here. Don't think I hit assign on that. Did I? I did. Here I'm just trying to kind of rough in a finger pose here. It's like now I'm going to start animating the ball, which I'm not quite sure why I really even worked on the fingers on the in that one pose. Definitely would make more sense to just animate the ball first, since the ball in the hand is going to kind of determine what that finger pose should be on the left arm. So maybe that's why I started posing out and then just stopped and moved on to the ball, because I realized, you know, the ball in the hand is going to kind of dictate that finger pose. So here I'm kind of trying to establish, you know, where the switch is going to happen. You can see I have a child of constraint, you know, with the ball parented to the FK right hand control, keying the influence on frame 30. So I think I want that to actually be where it turns off. So set a key on frame 29, set a key on frame 30, dial the influence to 0 on frame 30, and you can see the ball is going to drop a little bit lower in 3D space, and I should just have to transition it up and key it in the correct spot. And I do think I remember doing this and having a few difficulties with getting the constraint set up properly. One of the reasons is because I wanted to make sure when I set up this constraint system, I was doing it with sort of Blender's built-in tools for doing it. However, normally I use this parent constraint plugin that makes it much, much easier to do these constraints. Much faster, much easier. So like here I was like figuring out like the influence was obviously not working as correct as I wanted. I wanted to make sure the ball was still at the same position on frame 30, even though I turned the constraint off. So there I moved the cursor up to where the ball was when the constraint was turned on. The 3D cursor snapped it to that position of the ball. Then I actually snap the ball when the constraint is off to that 3D cursor. So it's in that correct position. And now I'm starting to animate the ball. So yeah, I wanted to use Blender's built-in tools for this, just to make sure that, you know, everybody kind of knows the sort of default process. But yeah, working with constraints, it's always good to, I always like to find plugins that make things easier. And, you know, that parent plugin still uses Maya's built-in tools, and that it's using a child of constraint. It's still creating the child of constraint, but it's helping and making the process of like dialing the influence off or on and keying that stuff, making sure the ball is at the same position when the influence is set to 1 as it is when it's set to 0, so that you can easily animate that transition. That plugin makes it a little bit easier to do that. Here I'm trying to figure out the ball motion through this. Obviously it's looking a little rough there with the spacing of it. So here I'm just playing around with the timing. And kind of figuring out what spacing will feel natural with this. Here I'm just changing that tangent handle to vector to keep it, pointed up. Again, trying to figure out the best timing, the best spacing for this movement. That feels natural. Obviously, that doesn't quite feel natural yet, so I'm kind of just figuring out how I should tweak these curves to get something that feels like she's actually just tossing the ball in the air, has, the weight that it should. And obviously, it's like just hanging up in the air a bit too long. And I think there I was checking, it felt like the ball was like constrained to something still. Like the way the ball was moving, it felt like the curves wouldn't be making it hang up in the air. Like it looked like it might have still had some constraint set up on like the torso or the hand. But I think it is this translate X curve that is causing the weird hang up there. But now I'm trying to go in there and tweak. And it's funny because, yeah, here like I noticed the the ball looking at it from just the front view, it looked normal, but the ball is shooting super far in front of her. Um, so here I was trying to figure out what curve I need to tweak to get this correct in place. So that's not just shooting out directly in front. Like here, I just tweaking that tangent handle and get something that already feels a little bit more natural. I remember it was funny starting the ball toss of this. This was like the thing that I was like, this will take 2 minutes. It's just animating a ball moving up and down. But yeah, I was like battling this to figure out why it was feeling so like caught, still feeling like very caught up in the air. It's like it's getting stuck on something, and it is just like going in and having to really refine these curves here and the spacing of it. Because like here, it's feeling like it's moving too far screen right really quickly and then just hangs there and then drops. So again, here I'm like tweaking these curves to get something a bit more flat. So it feels like it has more of a natural transition there into our hand. I think that's definitely feeling a bit better there overall. And I think here, I'm planning on setting up the switch here on the constraint and when it actually lands in the hand. Figuring out when I want to have that actually pop on. So I think I'm actually playing around with the timing on that ball, cutting it back 1 frame, so that basically with that jump in spacing, it's in the air, and I can kind of tweak that transition there from, it's in the air, and then as soon as the next frame happens where it's actually in the hand, that's when that constraint switch is going to happen. So I'm switching these constraints between turning it on to be constrained to the left hand in that kind of jump in spacing there to kind of hide, help hide the fact that there is a constraint switch. Doing a constraint switch like that when there's, lots of movement is always a good idea. Here I'm just setting up the child of constraint, choosing, the rig of the character there, the Lisa rig as the target, then going in and choosing the bone to constrain this ball to, which is the FK left hand, set the inverse there to snap it back into position, and it should work. I believe I'll have to tweak the influence here in a moment, because I feel like now it's going to be, even though the ball's animated, it's going to be stuck parented to that hand. So you can see it's like fighting the animation of the ball, and then it's, parented to the hand. So it's having to compete with those two things. So here I'm making sure I'm setting the influence, keying that, setting the influence to 0 on frame 47, setting it to 48 or 1 on frame 48. So turning that back on. I think here I was having issues with the influence. I was keying it at 0, but it didn't seem to be wanting to key. So I just showed the values in the curve editor. I actually keyed it at 0 in the graph editor to make sure that influence was set up properly. So there you can see we've got the ball switching hands there. So I think, the bulk of this animation is done now. Now it's definitely going in and animating the fingers. I'll probably do a head pass as well. Have her kind of looking where the ball is traveling. So here the hands will need to close in. So I'll start, editing this pose here. Then on this finger pose, I'm trying to bring the fingers closer together by just translating them. Because that's another thing on this rig with the fingers. The fingers are, they feel like they're very spread apart. So it feels a bit unnatural. Oftentimes, in real life when we're just, holding something or even just sitting with relaxed, our fingers are usually, very close together where they're kind of all touching. There's not a giant, gap between our fingers unless we actually have, our hands, our fingers spread apart. Now you will have some, parts where, the fingers might be a little bit further apart. But generally you want to have, kind of that close, kind of tight feeling on the fingers. So oftentimes you will have to kind of translate the finger controls to get something that feels a bit better. And I think what happened here, and I don't think I noticed yet, is that I made that pose and I jumped to a different frame and that pose went away. And if you'll notice, my auto key is not turned on. You can see I just noticed that. Not sure how or when it got switched off, but it got switched off. That's something important. I always have auto key on because that happens all the time. I don't remember to just set a keyframe after I create a pose. So if you create a pose like I just did and then change what frame you are on the timeline, that pose is going to get removed. It's going to switch back to whatever it was. So that's what happened there. I posed it out, and then it didn't have auto key on, so it didn't save that pose. Moved to a different frame, and then it just reset. So I'm not sure how. I must have accidentally clicked that auto key button and turned it off. So you can see I kind of have the fingers, open as the ball's coming down, and the hand is working on grabbing. Here I kind of have starting to spread the fingers out a bit, having the middle ones closer together and the outside ones a little bit further apart. Obviously didn't like that too much, so I just went back to the way it was. I think I'm going to change them a bit, but not push it as far as I just did. Here I'm just pressing Control C, Control V to paste, copy that pose in frame 51, paste it to frame 60. And I shouldn't really need to do much other finger animation because she's just holding the ball at that point. Just starting to get some basic head pose in here, start working on some basic animation for the neck and the head. Here I think I'm going to start animating the head to look up a bit at the ball as she throws it, to kind of just track it with her head a bit. Still want it to feel pretty casual in that she's, looking where the ball is, but like in my reference, it was kind of just, just a casual sort of like look at the ball, making sure she kind of knows where it's going so that she can catch it. Here, I think I'm going to start bringing the head down a bit. Kind of look where that ball is. You can see this is all pretty quick, just getting like a quick pass with the head in there. You can see I'm just working with a couple keyframes there on the timeline. I think what I'm doing there is just kind of playing that animation back and forth, like seeing what feels weird, what I can fix about it. I think the head was just drifting for several frames back into its final position, which felt weird. So I think I'm having a bit more of trying to get more of like an overshoot settle in the head at the end, rather than having it just like hit that down pose that it was hitting and then just drifting back into its final position. So just adding a couple frames in there to kind of refine that. Obviously, I don't like that wobble back that other direction. Feeling weird. I think I probably have to counter that head movement a bit. But again, this is just a lot of times with animation, kind of just trial and error, trying things, seeing if they work. If they don't work, move on to something else, try something else. This is one part about animation that I do really enjoy, is actually sort of almost the kind of troubleshooting of animation where you don't like the way it was, and you're kind of just figuring out what feels more natural, what feels better. And a lot of that is just trial and error. Maybe the head will overshoot the neck a bit and then kind of overshoot to the right and then back to center at the very end. And then just obviously you can see I just spent a couple seconds like testing that out, seeing if I like it. And I think there was something there that I like, so I kind of just refining that movement a bit. And you can see I save a lot of versions of my animation. I'll always create kind of just version up quite often. Oftentimes I'll, when I'm creating animations, spending days on an animation, I'll be on like version 80, 90, because I'm constantly, when I'm saving, versioning up, just in case I ever need to go back. I have them all there. And here I'm just doing a really quick pass on the eyes. I did notice the eyes are in different spots. You can see one is really low, the other is really high, so I think there's like values on this eye control that I had to zero out. Looks like there I just shifted all the frames there for the neck of the head back one frame at the end, so it tracks the ball a little bit better. Tweaking that rotate X on the head, dialing back the amount it drops down. Here, just going back to the eyes and making sure they're kind of tracking the ball. You can see this just a very quick pass on this. Here I'm starting to animate the right fingers, doing a quick pass on those, so creating a selection set so I can quickly select all the finger controls. And basically just doing a quick pass on like animating the open of the fingers as they let go of the ball. And tweaking the finger pose here, I'm not exactly sure what I'm trying to do at this point. Looks like I'm just kind of zeroing them out to open them all up. Kind of just opening the fingers a bit on this toss. Then they start to kind of close back. I think I just brought all the finger controls back to their default, which is by default this kind of like relaxed pose. And then here, just getting like some really quick movement in the fingers. Can definitely spend a lot of time on like finger polish and doing a really nice finger pass, but here I'm kind of just quickly trying to get something in there. So obviously very basic. With those fingers. I think the video is about winding down the entire process. I think I'm making like a final little tweak to the arm on the catch. But yeah, you can see, just under an hour and a half using this layered method, you're able to get, really nice results really quickly. And then obviously, you can build and further polish, further refine this. Obviously, the hair is not animated. We just did, a really quick, rough finger pass on both hands, just general posing of kind of just opening them and closing them when they need to be. Yeah, there's definitely more refinement, polish to do. The eyes aren't exactly looking where they should be. So I think that eye pass could definitely use some more tweaking. Yeah, this is a method I do enjoy using as part of my workflow quite a bit. Again, like to focus on the movement first, animating that cog control. And this is a really nice, simple example for, trying a layered method like this, and that there isn't a lot of movement going on. I intentionally animated this where I'm standing in place and my weight shift is just shifting from one leg to the other, and I'm throwing the ball in the air. I'm not stepping, I'm not doing anything. So if you're, really wanting to experiment with a layered method like this, a shot like this is really great to do that. Because again, there's not a ton of movement going on. Your character isn't turning around. Your character isn't like running and stopping. It's all contained at one spot. You're able to focus on, starting from the center of the character and kind of moving out, starting with that main kind of cog control, establishing the overall movement, figuring out the timing and the spacing of the left and right movement, which I did at the beginning. Then slowly layered on a bit of hip animation, then a bit of chest animation, then started working on the right arm and shoulder, and then just continually refined and built upon the animation kind of one layer at a time. And again, this does help you establish movement first, timing and spacing first, and then, refining the poses as you go as needed. So yeah, I think that's going to wrap it up for this lecture. Hopefully this was helpful for you and you're able to get, a good glimpse at a layered approach in a kind of a simple shot. That might be a good one to do, if it is your first kind of time tackling more of a layered method, starting with a simpler shot like this. So yeah, hopefully this was helpful.